Hi everyone. In this lecture, we will talk about API versioning. APIs can evolve and changes in APIs are inevitable. That is okay, but what kind of changes should we allow and how do we do the changes? First of all, it is good to have a formal versioning in place. We could use semantic versioning, which includes major, minor patch versions inside the version definition. For a breaking change, we should update the major version. For non-breaking changes, we can update the minor version. And for patching, we can just update the patch in the version definition. When it comes to REST APIs, we should try to keep it simple for both server and client and prevent big changes on both sides. So for non-breaking changes, actually just updating the server and including minor version change in the documentation would be enough. This way, client will only see a change in the documentation and doesn't need to update its client code or the way of sending the request data or parsing the response. But what about breaking changes which requires major version change? Are those inevitable? To answer this question, let's first think about two important concepts here: backward compatibility and forward compatibility. Backward compatibility says that if you have an updated server and a new updated client, which is actually updated to be able to work with the new updated server, then the new client will also work with the old server code. Forward compatibility, on the other hand, says that the client will be able to work with an updated server without doing any change on the client side. So, considering the compatibilities, when do we need to create a new version? First, we need to create a new version if we want backward compatibility, because it implies to have two versions in live by definition, since the new client would want to work with both new and old server. Second, if you cannot be forward compatible, which actually implies that you have a breaking change, then it will end up with a client that cannot work with the new server and will need to be updated. In that case, you need a new version, as you must keep the old version live until client is ready to be updated for the new breaking change in the system. So we can say that if we can avoid breaking changes and let the client work with the new server changes, for example by using extensible schemas, which is easier to implement with JSON, then we can avoid new versions. If you do not have a breaking change, just do not update the major version, but update the software and only include the minor changes in the documentation, so that the version number in URL and accept header will remain the same and nothing will change for client library or request data. Note that avoiding a major version update should be preferable, as it will lead to less work for both client and server. So let's say we could not escape from a breaking change. Then how do we do the versioning in the API? We have four options. First one is using URI versioning. It leads to a large URI footprint and difficult to maintain and use, and also less flexible. URI versioning is against the hypermedia-driven REST APIs, which states that the initial URI shouldn't be changed and be the only information given to the client along with media types, where REST will be resolved by hypertext returned to the client. On the other hand, it is easier to use by client, as using other options require more programmatic approach, and it is also cache-friendly, as caching with URI is very easy. However, using a header for that purpose requires more work. Example of using a URI versioning will be like using v1 and v2 in the URL, as you see here. Second one is the media type versioning, which is also called content negotiation. It versions in the representation using accept header or custom vendor media type. This one requires more work to implement, especially at the client side, and more difficult to use with caching. On the other hand, it is flexible to version part of the API and works well with Hey2us and Level 3 REST APIs according to Richardson maturity model. Here are the examples for content negotiation using VND API v1 plus JSON or VND API v2 plus JSON. There are also custom HTTP headers, versioning with custom header, and query parameters, versioning with query parameter option. These are less commonly used ways to version an API. You can also see the example usages of these versioning techniques here. We will have an example of URI and media type versioning in the next lecture. So I will see you in the next lecture to continue the implementation of API versioning.